Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The first time Chica saw Deez, she was sitting under a mango tree on campus, scribbling furiously into a worn notebook. It was the height of Harmattan, the air dry and filled with fine dust, yet she seemed untouched by the discomfort around her. She had on a faded yellow dress that looked 2 sizes too big, and her natural hair was tied back with a piece of cloth that might once have been white. Chica, a lanky young man with calloused hands from his part-time carpentry work, had just come from a construction site. His shirt was stained, his shoes dusty, and he knew he didn't look like much. But something about the way she was focused on her writing, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, drew him in. They spoke that day about books, the price of rice in the market, and how both of them had to juggle multiple jobs to keep afloat in school. There was no romance yet, just an unspoken recognition that here was someone who understood the grind. In those early months, their friendship was a thing of small gestures and long conversations. Deez would bring him fried plantains wrapped in newspaper when he was too broke for lunch, and he would walk her to the women's hostel even when it meant trekking an extra 40 minutes to his own lodge. They studied together under dim hostel corridor lights, laughed over shared plates of jollof rice, and borrowed each other's notes. Chica had grown used to a life of independence. His parents had died when he was 16, leaving him to fend for himself. But Deez made him realize that sharing burdens could be its own kind of strength. She, in turn, was drawn to his quiet resilience, the way he could take a disappointment and keep moving forward. It wasn't grand gestures that tied them together, but the way they filled the gaps in each other's lives. By their final year, it was obvious to everyone they were more than friends. Chica saved for months to buy her a small silver necklace, presenting it to her on a windy evening as they walked by the campus chapel. She cried not because it was expensive, it wasn't, but because she knew what it had cost him in sacrifices. When they graduated, they both faced an uncertain future. Jobs were scarce, and life in the city was expensive, but they promised to fight for each other. "If we survive now," Chica told her one night as they lay on a thin mattress in their tiny rented room, "we'll survive anything." Deez smiled through her exhaustion and believed him. 2 years into their marriage, Chica and Deez had carved out a modest but warm life together. Their one-bedroom apartment wasn't much. The paint on the walls was fading, and the kitchen window had a stubborn crack that let in too much dust, but it was filled with laughter. Evenings often found them curled up on the couch, Deez's head resting on Chica's lap as they talked about their dreams for the future. Chica worked long hours as a junior architect at a construction firm, while Deez ran a small but growing tailoring business from home. It was in that little apartment that they learned the rhythm of each other's habits. How Chica liked his tea without sugar, but with a pinch of ginger. How Deez hummed old gospel tunes while ironing clothes. How they could sit in comfortable silence without the need for constant conversation. When Deez discovered she was pregnant, it was as though the air in the room changed. Chica had been repairing a loose hinge on their wardrobe when she told him, and the screwdriver slipped from his hand as he stared at her in shock before breaking into the widest grin she had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet despite her protests, and spun her around until they were both laughing breathlessly. From that moment, he became fiercely protective, taking over chores, ensuring she ate regularly, and walking her to every antenatal appointment. On nights when her nausea kept her awake, he would sit with her, rubbing her back and telling her stories to distract her from the discomfort. "I'll be the kind of father you can boast about," he told her once, voice thick with emotion. She believed him without hesitation. Those months were some of the happiest of Deez's life. Chica would come home with small surprises, a bag of roasted groundnuts, a headscarf in her favorite color, a single slice of cake, just to make her smile. They discussed baby names late into the night, debated the merits of cloth versus disposable diapers, and imagined what their child might look like. If anyone had told Deez then that she would one day doubt Chica's loyalty, she would have laughed in their face. Their love felt unshakable, built on a foundation of years of shared struggle. But life, as they would both learn, had a way of testing even the strongest walls. It was during a corporate networking dinner that Adiz first met Gloria. Chica had invited her along, proud to show off his wife to his colleagues. Adiz dressed in a simple but elegant navy gown she had sewn herself, her hair styled in neat twists that framed her face. The evening began well enough, with polite conversation and laughter over small plates of peppered goat meat. But midway through the event, a tall, striking woman in a red dress approached their table. Gloria was the kind of woman who turned heads, confident posture, a dazzling smile, and eyes that lingered a little too long when she looked at someone. She leaned down to greet Chica with a familiarity that made Adiz's stomach tighten. "This must be the famous Adiz," Gloria said, her tone smooth, almost purring. She extended a hand, her nails perfectly manicured, and Adiz took it, forcing a polite smile. Chica introduced her as his colleague from the design department, adding that they had worked closely on several recent projects. Throughout the evening, Adiz noticed subtle things: how Gloria's laughter seemed louder when Chica spoke, how she found excuses to brush his arm when making a point, how her gaze would linger on him before flicking briefly to Adiz with a glint that wasn't quite friendly. It was nothing overtly disrespectful, but enough to plant a faint unease in Adiz's chest. On the way home, Adiz mentioned Gloria in passing, asking how long they had worked together. Chica seemed oblivious to her undertones of concern. "Oh, Gloria? She's harmless," he said with a shrug. "She jokes a lot. That's just how she is." Adiz let it go, telling herself she was overthinking it. After all, she trusted Chica completely. But deep down, something in her intuition stirred. Not loud enough to alarm her yet, but just enough to whisper that Gloria was not a woman who admired boundaries. The weeks following the networking dinner unfolded with the same rhythm as before, but there were small shifts, imperceptible to anyone else. Yet Adiz's intuition caught them like faint ripples in otherwise calm water. Chica began mentioning Gloria's name more frequently in casual conversation, often in the context of work challenges. "Gloria said the client was impossible to please," he'd say, or "Gloria stayed late last night to finish the blueprint." There was nothing inherently suspicious in the words, but Adiz noticed the warmth in his tone, the ease with which Gloria's name slipped into his sentences. At first, she tried to dismiss it as harmless. After all, she had never known Chica to lie to her. But then came the subtle stories he would tell, laughing about how Gloria had spilled coffee on herself in a meeting or teasing about how she could out-talk anyone in the office. These weren't romantic anecdotes, but they painted a picture of familiarity that made Adiz's chest tighten. For Chica, the changes were almost unconscious. Gloria had a way of inserting herself into his day without him realizing how much space she occupied in it. She'd pop into his office with some excuse: "Forgot my pen, wanted to ask about the client brief, look at this funny meme." And each time, she carried an energy that contrasted sharply with the weight of Adiz's pregnancy at home. Gloria was lively, quick-witted, and effortlessly flattering, while Adiz at this stage was tired, irritable, and often in pain. Chica didn't compare them consciously, but the contrast lingered at the back of his mind, making Gloria's presence feel like a light reprieve. That was how temptation often began, not with dissatisfaction, but with distraction. And Gloria knew exactly what she was doing. Adiz's unease deepened the day she visited Chica at work unexpectedly, bringing him his favorite lunch, white rice with vegetable stew. She walked into his office to find Gloria perched on his desk, leaning forward to show him something on her phone. They both looked up, surprised, and Gloria's smile faltered for the briefest second before she slid off the desk. "You must be Adiz," she said, her voice overly warm. Chica looked guilty, though there was nothing outright scandalous about the scene. But to Adiz it was the casual closeness, the way Gloria had been in his space, the familiarity in her body language, that felt wrong. On the way home, she didn't bring it up, but her thoughts churned like storm clouds waiting for rain. Pregnancy was not easy on Adiz. The first trimester had been a battle with nausea and fatigue, and now, in the second, she was struggling with backaches, mood swings, and restless nights. Chica tried to be patient, but there were days when her sharp tone met his tired sighs, and minor disagreements flared into arguments neither of them had the energy to resolve. One Friday evening, Chica called to say he'd be home late because of a client presentation. Adiz didn't question it, but by the time the clock hit 10 p.m., she was pacing the living room, fighting the rising sting of tears. When he finally walked in, smelling faintly of aftershave that wasn't as usual, she asked, "Where exactly were you?" Her tone carried more accusation than she intended. Chica bristled immediately. "I told you I was working," he said defensively, dropping his bag a little too hard. The argument escalated from there, spiraling into unrelated complaints. How she felt he was distant lately. How he thought she was overreacting to everything. They both knew it wasn't just about that night. It was about the growing space between them, the unspoken tension neither wanted to name. Adiz eventually retreated to the bedroom, her hands resting protectively over her belly, while Chica sat on the couch, staring at the dark TV screen. In his mind, he was hurt that she doubted him, but in hers, she was hurt that he gave her reasons to. The silence between them in the days that followed wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was a brittle, careful kind of quiet, as though both were afraid that one wrong word would shatter it entirely. Gloria, of course, sensed the shift before Chica even mentioned it. She was skilled at reading people, and when he walked into the office with that slightly drawn look in his eyes, she pounced. "Rough night?" she asked with feigned innocence, and when he admitted they'd argued, her lips curled into the faintest smile before she masked it with sympathy. "Pregnancy hormones can be tough," she said, touching his arm lightly. "But you're a good man for putting up with it." It was a small comment, but it landed like a drop of sweet poison, affirming his worth while subtly framing Adiz as difficult. Chica didn't see the manipulation for what it was. Not yet. Gloria's next move was calculated, though it appeared entirely casual. She began sharing more of her own relationship woes with Chica, always painting herself as the victim of men who didn't value her. She spoke about an ex who never listened, another who was emotionally unavailable, and one who cheated with her friend. She told these stories in a way that positioned Chica as the opposite, the rare man who was loyal, kind, and attentive. It was a psychological tactic, and it worked. Chica found himself wanting to reassure her, to be the kind of friend who proved not all men were like that. And with every conversation, the lines between professional colleague and emotional confidant blurred just a little more. At home, Adiz noticed Chica spending more time on his phone in the evenings. When she'd ask who he was chatting with, he'd say it was work-related, and sometimes it genuinely was. But other times, it was Gloria sending him memes, asking about his day, or venting about some imagined slight from her boss. Adiz's instincts told her this wasn't healthy, but she didn't want to sound like a jealous wife. Instead, she tried to focus on preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and organizing the nursery corner of their bedroom. Still, every time Chica smiled faintly at a message or left the room to take a quick call, something in her chest tightened. Gloria's strategy was slow erosion. She never pushed too hard, never made her intentions obvious. Instead, she let the bond grow under the guise of friendship, all the while studying Chica's vulnerabilities. She knew he took pride in being seen as dependable, and so she made herself appear in constant need of his dependability. She knew he disliked unnecessary drama, so she crafted an image of herself as easygoing, the opposite of what she subtly painted Adiz to be. By the time she offered to bring him lunch at work, it felt natural to him, not like a boundary crossed. For Gloria, it was all going according to plan. For Adiz, it was the beginning of a storm she couldn't yet name, but could already feel pressing on the horizon. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of day that should have ended with Chica walking through the door, kissing Adiz on the forehead, and sitting down to the hot meal she had kept warm for him. Instead, at 6:45 p.m., just as he was preparing to pack up from work, Gloria appeared at his office door with a frustrated sigh and a story about her car breaking down in the parking lot. She asked if he could take a look, and when he hesitated, she added, "Please, Chica. It's already getting dark, and I don't feel safe waiting out there." That appeal to his sense of responsibility was all it took. He told Adiz over the phone that he'd be working late on a client's blueprint review, a small lie that slid too easily off his tongue for someone who prided himself on honesty. He didn't even pause to consider the weight of what he had just done. He told himself it was harmless, that it would save Adiz from worrying. Gloria knew exactly what she was doing. She had already called a roadside mechanic earlier, but she kept that detail to herself, letting Chica believe he was her only solution. She stood close while he leaned over the hood, her perfume lingering in the air, her laughter light whenever he made a sarcastic comment about the car's ancient engine. The mechanic arrived within 15 minutes, but Gloria insisted on buying Chica dinner as a thank you. "You've been such a lifesaver lately," she said, her eyes locking on his in a way that made him look away quickly. The meal was casual enough, but it was after 9:30 p.m. when he finally left, and by then he had missed Adiz's calls twice. When Chica got home, Adiz was sitting on the couch with a folded wrapper over her legs, the TV still on, but unwatched. She didn't accuse him of anything. She simply asked how work had gone, her tone even but her eyes searching. He gave her the rehearsed answer, omitting any mention of Gloria. She nodded slowly and turned back to the TV, but he felt the shift in the air. Trust, once unquestioned, now had a hairline crack. Neither of them addressed it, but the lie sat between them like a pebble in a shoe, small enough to ignore for now, but destined to cause pain if left in place. The days that followed were a mix of normalcy and unspoken tension. Adiz tried to push the unease from her mind, telling herself she had no proof that Chica was doing anything wrong. But her instincts wouldn't quiet down. She began noticing subtle changes in his routines, how he kept his phone closer to him, even when they were just sitting together in the living room, how he sometimes smiled faintly at a message, and then quickly turned the screen away. She didn't want to be the kind of wife who demanded to check her husband's phone, but the restraint it took to hold her tongue left her feeling restless and on edge. She poured that energy into preparing for the baby, sewing tiny outfits, organizing diapers, and repainting the old cot they had been given by a family friend. One afternoon, over tea with her friend Amara, Adiz found herself voicing the thoughts she'd been keeping to herself. "I don't know if it's just me being paranoid," she said, "but I feel like something is different with Chica lately." Amara listened without judgment, then asked careful questions about the changes Adiz had noticed. When Adiz mentioned Gloria, Amara's expression tightened. "Women like that don't just hang around married men for nothing," she said. "Be careful, Ada. Sometimes they start as friends and end up as something else before you even realize it." The warning sat heavily with Adiz, though she tried to convince herself her marriage was stronger than that. That night, she watched Chica from across the dinner table as he talked about a new project at work. His face was animated, his hands gesturing in that way he always did when he was passionate about something. She wanted to believe that nothing had changed, that the man who had once walked barefoot with her to save bus fare was still hers entirely. But the memory of Amara's words lingered, and Adiz realized she was already bracing herself for a truth she prayed would never come. For Chica, the connection with Gloria was still something he told himself was harmless. She was easy to talk to, quick with encouragement, and never made demands on him the way Adiz's pregnancy sometimes did. He didn't see it as choosing between them. In his mind, Adiz was his heart, but Gloria was a distraction from the stress. What he didn't realize was that distractions, if fed, grew teeth. He began spending longer in Gloria's office after meetings, laughing at her jokes, sharing bits about his day that he hadn't yet told his wife. Slowly, she became the first person he told about small victories or frustrating setbacks at work. The wall that had always existed between friendship and something more began to thin, even if neither of them acknowledged it outright. Adiz noticed, of course. She saw how his eyes lit up when he spoke about work in ways that seemed tied to someone else's presence there. She caught the way he hesitated before answering her questions about who had been in certain meetings or who had helped him with specific tasks. She didn't press, partly because she didn't want to push him further away, and partly because she was afraid of what pressing might uncover. Instead, she tried to close the distance in other ways, surprising him with his favorite meals, leaving small love notes in his work bag, and reaching for his hand during quiet moments. Sometimes he responded with warmth. Other times he seemed distracted, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. The unspoken tension between them was beginning to take shape, and though neither of them said it aloud, They both felt the change. Chica rationalized that it was just a rough patch caused by the pressures of impending parenthood. Adiz feared it was something else, a slow erosion of the bond they had built through years of struggle. Neither of them realized that Gloria was already standing at the fault line, waiting for the right moment to deliver the final, calculated blow. It began innocently enough, or at least, that's how Chica justified it to himself. Gloria walked into his office on a Thursday afternoon holding 2 envelopes. "Team bonding dinner," she said, smiling. "The company is covering it for all department heads and their plus ones. But everyone else seems to have dropped out last minute." She gave a little shrug. "Guess it'll just be us." Chica hesitated, the first real twinge of unease flickering through him. He thought about mentioning it to Adiz, but then remembered how tired she had been lately, her feet swelling by evening, her moods unpredictable. He didn't want to spark a fight over something harmless. That's what he told himself as he nodded and said, "Sure, why not?" The restaurant was one of those dimly lit places with soft music and flickering candles on every table. Gloria arrived in a fitted black dress that drew a few stares from other diners. She complimented his shirt, teased him about being too serious, and ordered a bottle of wine, insisting he have a glass, just to relax. The conversation flowed easily, too easily, and Chica found himself laughing more than he had in weeks. He told himself it was just the relief of being away from work stress, but a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was letting a dangerous dynamic take root. The longer they sat there, the more he noticed the way Gloria's hand would brush his when she passed the bread, how her eyes lingered a beat too long when he spoke. He didn't pull away, but he didn't encourage it either. Or so he thought. When the evening ended, Gloria suggested they take a short walk before heading home. The city lights glowed against the dark sky, and they strolled in comfortable silence until she stopped in front of her apartment building. "You're a good man, Chica," she said softly, touching his arm. "Not many like you left." There was something in her voice, an invitation without words, and for a moment Chica stood frozen. Then he smiled faintly, stepped back, and said good night. He walked away that night, but he didn't realize that the seed she had planted had already begun to grow. 2 weeks later, Adiz was folding laundry when a wave of dizziness hit her. She grabbed the edge of the bed for support, but the room spun, and before she could call for help, she collapsed. When she came to, she was in a hospital bed, an 4-line in her arm, and the concerned face of her mother hovering above her. "You scared us, Ada," her mother said, voice trembling. Chica burst through the door moments later, his shirt rumpled, his eyes wide with panic. He rushed to her side, taking her hand in both of his. "Don't ever do that to me again," he whispered, his voice cracking. For the rest of that day, he barely left her side, feeding her, helping her sit up, and making her laugh despite the fear that had gripped them both. That night, as she drifted to sleep, Adiz looked at him with a softness that had been missing for weeks. "You're still my best friend," she murmured. Chica kissed her forehead and promised, really promised, that nothing and no one would come before her and their child. In that moment, he meant every word. He left the hospital the next day feeling resolute, determined to pull back from whatever dangerous territory he had been wandering into with Gloria. But temptation had a way of finding cracks in even the strongest vows, and Gloria was nothing if not persistent. When she heard about Adiz's scare, through office gossip Chica didn't even know had reached her, Gloria sent him a text. "I hope she's okay. Let me know if you need to talk." It was simple, seemingly innocent, but it opened the door again. Chica didn't reply immediately, but later that evening, when Adiz was resting, he found himself typing back, "She's better now. Thanks." It was all Gloria needed to know she still had a way in. Gloria waited a few days before making her next move. One afternoon, she appeared at Chica's office door looking unusually disheveled, hair slightly mussed, makeup smudged just enough to suggest she hadn't slept well. "I didn't know who else to talk to," she began, stepping inside and closing the door. She spoke in a rush about a breakup with a man Chica had never heard of, about feeling humiliated and betrayed. As she talked, tears welled up in her eyes, and she sank into the chair opposite his desk. Chica, uncomfortable with visible emotion, reached for a box of tissues and slid it toward her. She smiled faintly through her tears and said, "You always know how to make things better." They sat there for nearly an hour, Gloria telling stories of heartbreak that made her seem vulnerable, human, and, in Chica's mind, in need of protection. She leaned forward at one point, her hand brushing his as she took a tissue. "You're different," she whispered. "That's why I trust you." Chica felt the weight of the compliment, not realizing it was part of her calculated push to draw him closer. He told himself he was just being a good friend, that any man would do the same in his position. But when she stood to leave, and he found himself walking her to her car, lingering just a moment longer than necessary before saying goodbye, he knew, somewhere deep down, that he was moving toward a line he might not be able to step back from. Later that night, as Adiz rested against his shoulder on the couch, Chica scrolled through his phone and saw a message from Gloria. "Thanks for today. I don't know what I'd do without you." He typed out a reply, then deleted it, then typed it again before settling on, "Anytime." Adiz shifted in her sleep, her hand resting on his chest, and guilt pricked at him. But guilt was a weak opponent when set against the steady pull of temptation. It was a Friday that already felt threadbare at the edges. The office air conditioner had coughed itself into a sulk, the plotter jammed 3 separate times, and the client who swore final revisions on Tuesday returned with a new PDF marked final use this one in neon yellow. By the time Chica trudged home at 8:40 p.m., his eyelids were sandbags, his shoulders ached, and the promise of a shower felt like an answered prayer. Adiz met him at the door with a smile that tried to be bright and didn't quite make it. Her ankles were swollen, her back hurt, and beneath her small jokes lived a tiredness she no longer bothered to hide. "Go and sleep, please," she said, pressing his palm and guiding him toward the bedroom. It was her tenderness, the instinct to protect him even when she was the one carrying the weight of a whole person, that always disarmed him. He showered, let the water drum his skull, climbed into bed beside her, and slid into sleep so quickly it felt like falling through a trapdoor. When his phone buzzed on the nightstand at 10:22 p.m., he didn't wake at first. It buzzed again at 10:23, then 10:24, persistent, insistent. Adiz stirred, turned on her side, and her hand brushed the phone. "It's Gloria," she murmured, softer than breath. He blinked himself awake as guilt and instinct collided in his chest. He answered with the kind of half-alert voice that already apologizes without knowing why. "Hello." Gloria's sound came tinny and brittle, muffled traffic, a breath catching, then a carefully planted tremor. She said she was stranded outside a co-worker's place after a late strategy session, that her ride canceled, that the streetlights on her end were flickering, and 2 men had been loitering near a kiosk for too long. "I don't want to call any guy who'll read this wrong," she whispered, "and I can't reach a cab. Please, The sentence didn't finish, so much as crumble. It was theatrical in a way Chica might have noticed on a different night. But fatigue is a solvent. It dissolves the hard edges of judgment. He sat up. Adiz, propped on an elbow, searched his face. She could have said, "Don't go." She could have said, "Let me be the emergency in our lives tonight." Instead, she nodded, a small, reluctant benediction, and said, "Be quick, please. Send your location." Her voice held a quiet trust that wrapped itself around his ribs and tugged. In the doorway, he turned back and pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll be back in 30 minutes, he said, which is how every fateful errand begins. The night smelled of wet dust and old diesel. He drove with the radio off, the dashboard clock dragging its seconds. Gloria stood beneath a humming streetlight in an ash-gray jacket, arms folded tight as if to hold herself together. When she slid into the passenger seat, the car filled with the faint scent of hibiscus and something sharp. "Thank you," she breathed, and then she didn't speak for 2 blocks, letting gratitude do the work of intimacy. She asked to be dropped just a little way past the main road because the digital lock on her building had a trick to it. Could he wait to make sure she got in? He did. Of course, he did. On the stoop, she fumbled keys with a tremor that matched the one in her voice. It's dark in the hall," she said, and it was the gentlest possible invitation to cross a threshold. Inside, a bulb flickered on the landing. He meant to stand by the door, to be a silhouette of restraint. Instead, He followed her up 2 steps and paused at the third, close enough to smell the worry she had curated for him. "You're safe now," he said, "because men like him love to be the sentence that steadies a room." When she turned, gratitude tipped toward something else in the angle of her mouth. "I knew you'd come," she said. The line had the finality of a door clicking shut. Gloria's apartment was curated calm. A single trailing pot hose in the window, soft lamplight pooling on a woven rug. Kitchen counters cleared to the austerity of a show home. She put water on the stove with the practiced hum of someone who understood that rituals can stage manage a mood. "You should sit," she said. And he did, perching on the edge of a chair like a man who wants credit for not taking up space. She set a mug before him, steam coiling up like an invitation, and told a story about how the co-worker's boyfriend had made a joke that wasn't a joke, how she'd laughed because laughter is a woman's first shield, how the night suddenly felt like a street with too many exits. Chica listened with the earnest frown of a person who believes listening is what makes him safe, what keeps his kindness stainless. She slipped out the jacket, the ash gray falling like a suggestion onto a chair back, and the dress beneath it explained its own mission. "You're the only person I trust not to use what I owe you against me," she said. "I'm tired of men who love the version of me that's begging." It was the neatest trap, making virtue feel like desire's best disguise. When the kiss happened, it didn't pounce. It arrived, like fog at the edge of a field, soft and inevitable. She stepped closer to hand him the mug, and somewhere between thank and you, the space lost its argument for continued existence. Lips touched, one heartbeat, two, and in that stumble of warmth the week's exhaustion made its case for relief. Chica pulled back first. "No," he said, too gentle, too late. Saying no after permitting the world to narrow to one shared breath is like closing a stable after the horse has learned where the gate is kept. Gloria's eyes were an instrument that knew its scale. "You think I don't see how alone you feel?" she asked, not accusing, almost tender. "She's exhausted. You're exhausted. You spend all day being the man who holds everything, and no one is holding you." She lifted a hand toward his face. He caught her wrist, not rough, and set it down. The look on his face bore the kind of shame that believes itself noble. "You're my colleague," he said. "I love my wife." He stood so fast the chair legs protested. "I have to go." On the landing, he exhaled the breath he'd been bargaining with for 10 minutes. Down 2 flights, out into the night that had been waiting, back into a car that suddenly smelled like a confession. Home was quiet except for the small domestic sounds of a life still choosing him. A tap drip, a distant neighbor's radio. Adiz was awake on the couch, one hand folded over the swell of her belly, the other smoothing the hem of a baby onesie she'd been inspecting. "You took long," she said, not brittle so much as careful. He reached for a sentence, any sentence. That wasn't an admission. "The lock was stubborn," he said. She was scared. He didn't notice the way she hung in the room with clothesline confidence. When he leaned close to kiss Adiz, her nose went still the way a deer's does when the forest changes temperature. Hibiscus. A note of something bitter and botanical he didn't wear. "You smell different," she said, eyes on his. He veered to a laugh. "Probably the hallway," he lied, which is how men tell themselves they are protecting a heart they're already hurting. Adiz did not argue. She turned off the lamp. The room climbed one shade deeper into night, and between their sleeping bodies the couch kept a ledger. Trust on one side, scent on the other. Both columns not yet balanced. Both hands already reaching for the scales. Days gathered themselves into a routine that pretended not to limp. Adiz's due date moved into the calendar square with the slow authority of a tide. They attended a birthing class where a cheerful midwife said the words breathe and surrender, so often the terms became synonyms. Chica massaged Adiz's lower back with oil she liked, counted to 8 on each exhale, learned how to time contractions with an app, asked half a dozen questions about what-ifs, because that's how love tries to domesticate fear. They folded tiny clothes and placed them in drawers like prayers. They argued softly, then less softly, about whether her mother should stay the first week. They made up over tea, and he kissed her fingers and said, "We'll do this together. I'll be right there. I swear it." The vow felt like scaffolding he could climb and not fall. Adiz believed him because love is also a muscle memory, and theirs had lifted heavy things before. But sometimes the past cannot predict the weight of a very specific future. Gloria did not press. She adjusted her angles. At work she kept a measured distance in front of others. Never too much laughter, never a hand on his arm where eyes could catalog it. But she kept a steady trickle of presence. A voice note at 6:12 a.m. the morning the site inspection went long. "You've got this." Clients love your steadiness. A neatly boxed lunch left without a note, but with a fork tucked under the lid. A spreadsheet she accidentally improved that rescued him an hour he didn't have. She wore her competence like lip color. Visible, flattering, not quite ignorable. In private, she found new language. Not need, but understanding. Not lonely, but seen. She asked about his father, about the year he left home at 16 and learned hunger's surname, about the ache in a man who is always building shelters for others. She was careful to admire what Adiz admired, his loyalty, his grit, so that her praise felt like the same gift, just packaged in novelty. Temptation rarely argues with your values. It borrows them, compliments them, and then asks for a single night off from strict adherence. On a Sunday afternoon awash with heat, Adiz sat at the window and wrote a letter she didn't plan to give him unless something went wrong. The light made a milky rectangle on the floor. Dust turned in it like lazy snow. She wrote about mango trees and harmattan, and a boy who fixed broken hinges with patience, about a necklace that wasn't expensive and felt like a fortune anyway, about the promises that had become the rails their life ran on. "If I am loud in labor," she wrote, "know that it is still love speaking. If I am quiet afterward, know it is exhaustion, not doubt. If I forget to say thank you, remember that I am grateful already." She folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer where the baby socks slept. That night they ate beans and plantain and watched a silly movie until she fell asleep with her head on his shoulder. Chica turned the volume down and watched her breathe. A promise tightened and retightened around his chest like a knot a sailor would trust with his life. When his phone buzzed face down on the coffee table at 11:07 p.m., he didn't pick it up. He let the buzz finish itself. He told himself that this restraint, proved something essential. 2 flats away, a different phone lit a different room where a different woman looked at the time and smiled like a strategist who had just moved her queen into a square no one else realized controlled the board. The morning of the trap began with the faint metallic taste of rain in the air. Adiz woke at dawn with a dull ache low in her belly, the kind that made her pause mid-step and breathe through her nose until it passed. She didn't call it labor yet, just tightening. And she told Chica not to worry as he got dressed for work. "Go. I'll be fine. It's probably nothing," she said, half smiling, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach as if soothing the child inside. Chica kissed her forehead and promised to keep his phone close. By midday, the ache had sharpened into something more insistent, and her mother, already staying with her, began making mental notes about hospital bags and cab fares. Adiz called Chica twice. He answered both times, his voice calm but distracted, assuring her he'd leave early just in case. What neither of them knew was that Gloria had already circled this day on her private calendar, the way a hunter marks a season's first sighting. At 3:14 p.m., Chica's phone buzzed with a message from Gloria. "Please, I need you. I'm scared." There was no preamble, no explanation, just the kind of brevity that suggested urgency. He called her immediately, and her voice trembled with carefully measured panic. "I'm at the old industrial lot near Adewale Street. My car won't start, and 2 men keep walking past, staring. I don't feel safe." The details were vivid enough to bypass his skepticism. "Can't you call someone else?" he asked, already standing. "You're the only one I trust right now," she said, letting the sentence land like a weight in his chest. In that moment, all the promises he'd made to Adiz tangled with the instinct to protect, a word he had always worn like armor. He told himself he'd swing by, make sure she was safe, and still make it to the hospital in time if Adiz needed him. 30 minutes, maybe less. He didn't tell Adiz he was going. He didn't want to alarm her over nothing. The industrial lot was quiet. the shadows long and lean against the rusting metal walls. Gloria was there, leaning against her car in a sundress that seemed careless but wasn't. She smiled faintly when she saw him, the kind of smile that said, "Thank God you came," even before her lips moved. "I don't know what I'd have done if you didn't pick up," she murmured. Chica checked under her hood, found nothing obvious, and suggested calling a tow. "Can we wait inside for it?" "It's too exposed here," she said, gesturing toward the nearby warehouse office. He hesitated just for a second, then followed her. Later, he would replay that second again and again, wishing he'd turned around instead. The office smelled faintly of dust and faded paper, with a single leather couch shoved against one wall. Gloria closed the door behind them, her movements deliberate but cloaked in the softness of someone pretending to be fragile. She offered him a bottle of water, then sat closer than necessary on the couch, their knees almost touching. "You've been such a blessing to me, Chica," she said, her voice low. "Do you know how rare it is to feel safe with someone?" He started to respond, but she leaned in, not fast, not aggressive, just enough for the air between them to collapse. The kiss was sudden in its inevitability, like a scene rehearsed in secret for months. His mind flickered with images of Adiz, her hand in his at their wedding, her laughter when he spun her in the kitchen, but the weight of the moment pressed down harder. For one dangerous heartbeat, he kissed her back. It was his phone that broke the spell. It rang once, twice, then again, vibrating insistently on the table. He pulled away, breath uneven, and glanced at the screen. Adiz's name. Without thinking, he silenced it. "It's probably just a check-in," he told himself, guilt already scratching at the back of his skull. Gloria reached for his hand, her thumb tracing the back of it in slow arcs. "Stay a little longer," she murmured. He didn't notice how many minutes passed until the phone lit up again, this time with a call from her mother. That should have been the alarm that yanked him out of the room, but instead he hesitated, torn between two worlds. "Let me just call her back in a bit," he said. Those bits would cost him more than he knew. By the time he finally left, the sun was sinking low, casting the streets in the kind of golden light that made the world look forgiving. But as he drove, his phone pinged with a message from Adiz's mother. "We're on our way to the hospital. Her contractions are close together." His stomach dropped. He pressed harder on the accelerator, weaving through traffic, but the truth was already written. He had been somewhere else when his wife needed him most. No explanation, however honest or edited, would erase that. The hospital room was a blur of white walls, beeping monitors, and the controlled urgency of nurses moving with practiced speed. Adiz clutched her mother's hand, her breaths coming in ragged bursts as another contraction gripped her. Between the pain, her eyes kept darting to the door, expecting, needing, Chica to walk in. Every second he didn't appear carved something deeper into her. "He's on his way," her mother said, though her own voice wavered. Another contraction came, and Adiz bit her lip so hard she tasted iron. Somewhere deep inside, she told herself it was fine, that maybe he was stuck in traffic, that he wouldn't let her do this alone. But each time the door opened, and it was just another nurse, a sliver of that faith splintered. When the baby's cry finally split the air, it should have been joy that followed. Instead, Adiz's tears came hot and bitter, mingled with sweat on her cheeks. The nurse placed the child on her chest, and she looked down at the tiny face, forcing herself to smile for her son even as her heart clenched. "Welcome, my love," she whispered. There was no anger yet, just a hollow ache that felt heavier than the hours of labor she had just endured. She wanted Chica to see this moment, to feel their child's first breaths against his skin. But the chair beside her bed stayed empty. It was nearly 40 minutes later when Chica appeared, breathless, shirt untucked, eyes wide as if he'd run the whole way from his car. He stopped short at the sight of Adiz cradling the baby, her gaze cool and unreadable. "I'm sorry," he began, but the words felt inadequate in the space between them. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back down at the baby, her hand smoothing the soft hair. "He's perfect," she said softly, to the child, not to Chica. In that moment, something shifted between them, subtle but irreversible, like a thread pulling loose from a tapestry. The cloth was still whole, But the unraveling had begun. 2 days after the birth, the ward smelled like antiseptic and boiled water and soft dreams, and Adiz found herself staring too long at the corridor clock, waiting for a certainty that never arrived. Chica had come the previous evening with flowers and apologies that stumbled over each other like men who didn't know the doorway was narrow. He'd held the baby with trembling reverence. He'd said, "I'm sorry," until the syllables lost their edges, and still she felt the absence like a wet coat on her skin. Her mother suggested they stay one more night, let your body gather itself. But Adiz felt an impulse bloom that even she did not fully understand. She wanted to stand inside her own living room, with this child in her arms, and see, without anyone explaining, what the air remembered. It wasn't a test, it was witness-bearing. So against the nurse's gentle warnings and her mother's frown softened by worry, she signed the papers, tucked the folded discharge sheet into her bag, and swaddled her son with hands that had learned a new gravity. The cab ride home crossed a city rinsed by last night's rain, gutters still busy, roads reflecting sky like mirrors that hadn't decided which world to keep. Her mother sat beside her, silent in that way mothers are when they can hear a daughter bracing. Adiz pressed her cheek to the baby's cap and told herself she was simply going to put things where they belonged. Onesies in a drawer, the baby's cot by the window, the truth in the bright light, where truth can't pretend to be anything else. The key turned easily. She had always oiled it on Saturdays. The door side opened to the faint charm of their home, books punished into neatness, the smell of lemon dish soap, the soft whir of the fan that stuttered in humid weather. She took 3 steps in and stopped. On the couch sat Gloria in a pale robe tied with a lazy bow, legs tucked beneath her, hair still damp as if a shower had rinsed her of excuses. On the kitchen towel stood Chica, shirtless, holding a dish towel and the kind of expression men wear when time has finally climbed onto the table between them and demanded fees for previous indulgences. It was a still life arranged by calamity, a glass with condensation tangled in a ring on the side table, Gloria's toenails painted a brave red, the sling of Chica's shoulders unarmored, a baby's soft sigh into his mother's chest, as if reminding everyone that the world had shifted so far already that morning. Ada, Chica, began, her name an unstrung instrument. Gloria's smile started and died, too much teeth, then none at all. Adiz didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask questions whose answers would only interview her wound. She looked once at the towel in his hand, once at the robe cord bow like a smirk, once at the window where afternoon was practicing evening, and then she turned. Her mother, at the threshold, saw it all in a blink and adjusted her grip on the bag. Together, wordless as women who have learned that words sometimes serve only to decorate a fire, they left. Down the stairs, the city's hum remembered them. The cab driver, still waiting because the meter and Mercy both said to, took in the scene, new mother, older woman, a bundle swaddled like dawn, and reached back to help with the door. As the car pulled away, Adiz did not look back. She had never much liked that cinematic insistence on the final glance, the one that drags your heart into a place your feet have already left. She pressed her lips to her son's brow and whispered his name like a benediction that would have to do the work of many for a while. Her mother squeezed her knee and said nothing for 7 whole streets, and then, in a voice that knew how to hold both grief and instruction, said, "We go home. We feed this child. We sleep. Later, you can decide what needs burning and what needs building." In the glass, the city fractured into frames, then stitched itself whole again. In her chest, the same. Somewhere an answer was forming, but answers are slower than breaths. For now, there was only the soft weight of a boy, and the merciful proof that not everything new had to be borrowed from pain. Silence arrived for Chica like weather he had not packed for. He stood in the doorway, holding the towel like a white flag he didn't remember collecting, watching the corridor where his wife had been a moment ago become only corridor again. Gloria moved first, rising with a rustle that pretended to be modesty. "She came back early," she offered. And even to her own ears the sentence sounded like a cramped excuse trying to fit into a room that had already been emptied of furniture. Chica looked at her then with an inventory he had avoided for months. The timing of her need, always when his was tender. The choreography of helplessness that somehow always ended with him in the theater wings, holding the sandbags with both hands. The way she spoke of safety, as if it were a currency she minted. "You need to leave," he said, voice low but hard as a bolt. Surprise crossed her face, then calculation, then a brief, unlovely hurt. "After everything?" she asked, letting the word everything wear perfume and a tremble. "There was never an us," he answered, and the towel dropped to the tile with a soft, merciless sound. She collected her things in quick, offended movements. At the door she turned as if she might still stage a last scene. But whatever script she brought had been cancelled by the single most expensive ticket of his life. He had missed the berth. The door closed behind her. The apartment, relieved of its intruder, felt heavier, not lighter, the way a body does when the anesthesia lifts and the wound announces itself in plain language. He went to the bedroom first because that was where the truest absences sleep. On the dresser lay the tiny socks Dee's had rolled into pairs like punctuation marks. In the top drawer, beneath a folded muslin cloth, he found a letter in her long, careful hand. He didn't open it. Something in him understood that reading words written in hope on the far side of the moment that murdered their certainty was a sacrilege best postponed. He sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the hospital wristband she had forgotten to return against his palm until the cheap plastic bit his skin. When he could breathe without flinching, he called. The first call went to voicemail, the second, too. He typed a message that started as apology and wandered into explanation. "Tow truck, industrial lot. I thought I'd be quick. I'm a fool. I love you, I love you." And then he deleted it because explanations often sound like alibis when pain is still loud. He called his mother-in-law. She answered with the voice of a woman who has seen men return with ashes where intentions once were. "They're safe," she said. He exhaled a small, unimportant relief. "Can I come?" he asked, already reaching for his keys. "Not today," she said, and the gentleness in it hurt worse than any shouted verdict. "Sleep. Wash your hands. Clean your house. Tomorrow we talk, maybe." The line clicked soft as a lid closing on a bowl of grief to keep it from too much dust. Night rearranged itself and finally agreed to be night. He scrubbed the kitchen until the lemon soap sharpened the air into something honest, stripped the couch of a throw that smelled like someone else's hair, opened windows, let the city's patient noise come in, and hold him accountable. In the living room, he wrote by hand, because some words prefer the friction of pen to glass. "I missed our son arriving. I missed you asking for my hand. I missed the doorway on purpose, and I can't polish that into an accident. I will not insult you with strategies. I will be outside whatever door you choose, doing the work that should have made this impossible." He did not know if he would ever be permitted to be a husband again. He did know he could begin being a man. He changed the sheets. He placed the letter on the dining table like bread he could not yet eat. Then he sat in the baby's corner on the tiny stool he'd assembled last month, rested his forehead on the rim of the empty cot, and cried the kind of quiet that makes a chest feel domiciled by a smaller animal. Dawn finally advanced a pale foot across the floorboards. Somewhere across town, his son pursed his mouth and dreamed of milk. Somewhere between his palms, the wristband's cheap plastic warmed, and then cooled as his grip loosened. This was not an ending yet. Endings are tidy, and nothing here wore tidy well. This was the beginning of the end. A man learning the difference between love as promise and love as daily labor, between being needed and being worthy, between wanting to be forgiven and becoming, with kneeling patience, a person who could be. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.